So tonight we are very honored to be here to have a chance to hear directly from 3 collectors who are participating in the exhibition, and hearing them talk about their own collection and their passion for collecting. Our guests this evening are John Duncan, Walter Evans, and Eleanore De Sole. And we chose these 3 collectors out of so many in the show as a way of highlighting the diversity of the ways people can think about building a collection. As you'll hear them talk, they have chosen very different paths of how to build a collection, but the common thread is that each is passionate with what they do and very clear in their own vision for art. I wanted to just give you briefly a note about tonight's format. What we'll do is I'll bring up individually each of the collectors. I'll introduce them briefly. They will come up individually and speak for just a few minutes about their collection, and then we will open it up to Q&A in the crowd for the second half of the evening. I also wanted to make sure that you all know that the galleries will be open, so after this talk, please go up, view the work, take a look at it, and then come down and join us in the Eckberg Atrium for a wonderful reception. So that's the format for tonight, and I think we're in for a real treat. So now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, John Duncan. We are very fortunate in Savannah to have a vast repository of historical materials and objects, including documents, maps, prints, photographs, paintings, and other works of art that tell the story of this city's history. You may think that I'm talking about the Georgia Historical Society or the Telfair, but I'm actually describing the collection of Dr. John Duncan and Virginia Duncan. A retired professor of history at Armstrong State University, where he taught for over 32 years, John has also been the go-to historian and source of visual material related to Savannah's history for decades. In 1983, he and Virginia opened an antique map and print shop, which is an indispensable stop for tourists and scholars alike. John has also loaned images to films and television projects and to numerous exhibitions in Savannah and beyond. Currently, you can see works from his collection in an exhibition of historic maps at City Hall, an installation of Savannah-related etchings and engravings at the Owens-Thomas House, and in the exhibition Port City, and of course in Savannah Collects here at the Jepson Center. Please join me in welcoming John Duncan.
I do not know if people are born with a collecting gene, but if they are, I have it, and it manifested itself in me very early on. During World War II, the U.S. government minted steel pennies just for 1 year, 1943. I was 6 at the time and collected hundreds of them. And then I finally disposed of them some 20 years later. Then I discovered books and began with books from dead relatives. As a 12th generation Charlestonian, I collected Charleston books until about 3 years ago when I gave 800 Charleston, or at least South Carolina books to Emory University, where I got my PhD degree. Emory later told me that there were only 2 other known copies of one book that I had given them. It freed up one whole wall in my library, but I simply brought down another 800 Savannah books this time from the 4th floor. While at Emory, I found a daguerreotype of John Quincy Adams. I paid $1 or $2 for it. I stacked it up with a number of others so they wouldn't really look too carefully. It had good documentation, and I sold it, and it allowed me to put a new roof on the 1819 Frederick Selleck house on York Street, which I owned at the time, but the water was coming in from the ceiling. It now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., and it proved to be the first photograph of any American president. Then I discovered fine art. I had taken art classes at the Gibbs Art Gallery in Charleston. I had actually purchased a watercolor of Japanese magnolias at the Gibbs when I was still in high school. While still in Charleston, I inherited from a great aunt a two-sided painting, one picture on one side, another picture on another side, by Amy Allen, who lived at 9 Gadsden Street in Charleston. In the 1980s, I got art conservator Terry Lowenthal to somehow divide them, and then got Hector Dewitt to frame them for me. I came to Armstrong in 1965 to teach I came to Savannah in 1965 to teach at Armstrong when it was still downtown. I lived in one of Georgia Fawcett's houses at 207 West Gordon Street and paid $50 a month. I met a neighbor, Martha Castles, who lived on West Jones Street, rent-free from Historic Savannah Foundation. They wanted people in these houses that were mostly empty. She was an artist, and I was smitten with a large painting she entitled Farewell to JFK, which she had painted, she said, the week of the assassination. I still have it, and it is very powerful. Over the years, I have acquired artistic estates, beginning with the art of Charlestonian Mercedes Erickson Hochul. She had died in the early 1980s. Her daughter flew in from out west and actually put her paintings on the curb for the trash man to take away. They were rescued by Jean Waddell, who was the director of the South Carolina Historical Society and the author of a 3-volume work on Charleston houses. He rescued them, passed them on to a distant cousin of mine, who then sold them to me. On one of our walls at 12 East Taylor Street are her watercolors of the quintessential southern flower, the Magnolia grandiflora. My favorite one is with brown petals, as any magnolia tree in May has half of its blossoms brown. In the late 1990s, I purchased the artistic estate of a third-generation Savannah silhouette artist, Helen Hatch Inglesby. Some of you may remember her solo exhibition, which the Telfair did a few years ago. Another artistic estate which I acquired was that of Ann Taylor Nash, a native of North Carolina, a resident of Charleston, and pals with Elizabeth O'Neill Verna. But eventually she moved to Savannah, where she died in 1968. Ogden Nash, who had lived on Howard Street, was a relative. Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. She was largely a society portrait painter. Next spring, the Telfair is planning a solo exhibition of some of the 59 of her paintings, which I own. From Dan Denny, when he moved from Monterey Square, I purchased an 1872 leather-bound book of watercolors of lilies and magnolias by Pennsylvania Quaker lady Deborah Passmore Gillingham. She took a steamer from Philadelphia down to Jacksonville and a stagecoach down south. Even when there was no Miami, she went as far as she could. She painted these lovely watercolors, and they were so beautiful that I got a book publisher to publish them in slightly smaller size with the pages perforated so you can pull them out and still have your book intact. So I'm kind of proud of that. Perhaps the best-known Savannah artist, best-known native Savannah artist, is Christopher Murphy, Jr. Over the years, I've collected his pencil drawings, his etchings, and a few of his paintings. 3 just a couple of months ago, by the way. And I recently gave 2 paintings to the Telfair. Last count, I have at least 50 of Christopher Murphy's works. As an antique map print and book dealer since 1983, I have collected local maps. They say you should not mix dealership and collecting, but I have done so. Until the end of December of this year, the rotunda of City Hall is displaying 8 of my best Savannah maps. The most iconic image of Savannah is the Peter Gordon, some say Noble Jones, view of Savannah as it stood in 1734. My copy is one of 12 known original copies and is currently on display on the 4th floor, is it? Yeah. And now I close with Myrtle Jones. She was a difficult person, but a wonderful artist. The first painting I acquired was through a swap. I painted her cottage on Tatnall Street, and she gave me a painting. About 1970, I purchased her painting of her maid Essie. She had been to Paris and was impressed with the Impressionist. We normally think of Impressionist paintings in Rococo frames, do we not? And that was because the impoverished artists in the 19th century went to the Paris flea markets and bought 18th century Rococo frames for their paintings. Myrtle had done so for her Essie. The corners of her frame were damaged, but I got Shea Avery and Marietta to recast the corners. Myrtle signed and dated Essie 1960, which is when she thought she had painted it. Copying, she said, Picasso, who would often sign when he actually sold. Later, I acquired another of her Essie paintings, this time showing the first one in the upper right-hand corner. She dated this second one 1959. 1 year earlier than the original one that she had dated 1960. One or both of those dates are incorrect. Myrtle was a poor record keeper, but a great painter. I'm age 77 and still collecting. My collecting obsession is a sickness, and I hope and trust I will never be cured of my malady. Thank you.
Thank you, John. What a wonderful story, starting with the pennies and still collecting. It's really, you do have the gene, I think. It is clear, but we're so glad you do. And thank you for all that you have done and continue to do for Telfair. Appreciate it so much. So now our second special guest, Dr. Walter O. Evans. Born in Savannah, Dr. Evans developed an interest in art while finishing medical school in Detroit. Noting the lack of African American art in major museums, he began a mission to assemble a collection which is now regarded as one of the most important surveys of African American art and literary production in existence. Since the beginnings of his collection in the late 1970s, Dr. Evans has amassed a collection that now includes thousands of paintings, sculptures, photographs, and fine prints representing works from 19th century to contemporary African American artists. It would take all evening to list all of the projects, exhibitions, and other ventures that he has participated in or spearheaded over a long and distinguished career. In Savannah alone, Walter and Linda Evans have had a tremendous impact on the arts, lending the collection to large exhibitions at the Beach Institute in the early 1990s, at the Telfair in 2003, and establishing the Walter O. Evans Collection at the SCAD Museum of Art. At Telfair, in addition to loaning works for exhibitions, Walter served on the museum's Board of Trustees during the critical period, which included the opening of the Jepson Center. He has advocated for the museum, supported educational programming, helped found the museum's Friends of African American Art Auxiliary Group, founded and secured funding for the Jacob and Gwendolyn Lawrence Lecture Series, and donated Augusta Savage's beautiful bronze portrait of Gwendolyn Knight Lawrence to Telfair's permanent collection. Dr. Evans generously shares his collection with museums across the country, and his work is currently included in shows at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and of course, here in our own Jepson Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Walter Evans.
Thank you, and thank you for asking me to participate in this Wonderful, wonderful exhibition. Well, I did not start out appreciating art. As a matter of fact, I don't remember any art training in all of my K through 12 years in school. I certainly never entered an art museum until after high school, not going to college right away. I went into the Navy, and my last of 3 years in the Navy, I met a young lady, and she wanted to go on a date. Now, many of you know this story, so if I'm being repetitive, forgive me. But she wanted to go on a date to the Philadelphia Art Museum. I was stationed at the U.S. Naval Hospital there as a hospital corpsman. And I had never been in an art, I mean, if she had wanted to go to the racetrack, I guess I would have been collecting horses now. So I went to the library. There were no computers in those days. This was over 50 years ago. And I went to the library, the Philadelphia Library there, the main library, and I looked up all of the artists, many of the artists that I would see on that date. They were mostly European Impressionists, Thomas Eakins, Benjamin Rush, and so on and so forth. Major artists, but most of them I had never heard of. I had perhaps heard of Picasso, but not many others. So when we got to the museum, I started telling her about Renoir and Degas. I said, do you know that Degas has family now in New Orleans, and so on and so forth. So she was quite impressed. Well, a year or so later, I went to college, Howard University, but in the interim, we had been to museums in New York. Philadelphia is a tremendous place to visit art museums because, first of all, there are so many there. The Rodin Museum, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, the Swarthmore College that had exhibitions, there's the University of Pennsylvania that had exhibitions there, so I visited all those, in addition to the ones in New York and Washington. And when I got to Washington at Howard University, I, of course, visited the Smithsonian Museums and the National Gallery of Art. I still remember walking into this room and seeing this Salvador Dali, The Last Supper, in the room, in the gallery by itself. And it was just, it made such an impression. But it would be many years, since that date at the museum, perhaps 15 years before I would have even a nickel of disposable income to start acquiring art. But in the meantime, I had done a tremendous amount of traveling on my own to museums all over Europe and the US. So I pretty much knew a great deal about European and European American artists, but I didn't know much of anything about African American artists. Well, just when I got my first nickel of disposable income, the Detroit Institute of Arts commissioned 22 silkscreens by Jacob Lawrence. They own the John Brown series, and there were 60 portfolios that were for sale, and I acquired one of these portfolios, and that was my first major purchase of art. So then, I started reading about the African American artists because I hadn't seen any in any of the museums I had visited in the U.S. And a little bit in Paris, some Tanner, and a few others. There were other expatriates in Europe whose work I had seen, but I really didn't know much about it. It just so happens that a couple of weeks after my purchase of this John Brown series, I was in New York, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Benny Prim, friend of mine to this day, was hosting Romare Bearden's, a fundraiser for Romare Bearden's wife, who had a dance studio, and he was selling these original works of arts, and I acquired a work there. Well, while there in New York on that visit, I made arrangements for Bearden and Nanette, his wife, his photographer and his agent to come to Detroit, and we had one of these fundraisers in Detroit at my home. And that started a series that I started doing for the next 25 years. Each year, I would bring 2 artists or writers, authors, to Detroit for the people of Detroit to enjoy. And most of the time they stayed at my home. People such as Jacob Lawrence, and Bearden was the first, Elizabeth Catlett, Gwendolyn Brooks, and so on and so forth. But every year until I left 13 years ago, I had at least 2 artists come to Detroit, and as I said, most of the time they stayed with me at my home. Well, my first purchases were more or less African-American artists from the Harlem Renaissance era, that's the 1920s to the 60s and 70s. But I'm not going to get into the story about how and why. It is a tremendous story involving someone that served with me on the SCAD board, Richard Manoogian. And having acquired this 19th century African-American artist, I had never even thought about collecting, landscapes and portraits, which all of them did during that time. Well, I won't get into that story, but that's when I started acquiring 19th century work, and later abstract or contemporary, what we call contemporary artworks. Well, we were asked to talk about stories, just tell a story about a certain work of art, perhaps, and I wanted to tell you this story. The piano lesson. Now, I can tell you tremendously interesting stories on at least 50 or 75 works of art that we acquired, but I'll tell you this one. It was about 1981 or so, maybe, yeah, I think it was it must have been 1983. This work of art was at the Cordia Ekstrom Gallery in New York on 79th Street, and I called Bearden and asked him if he would meet me there. I told him I wanted to see him. This was a few days after the opening. So he showed up at the gallery one Saturday morning, and I chose this work to purchase. But I told him, I said, well, let me run it by a few friends and see what they think or so. And so I decided not to buy it at that time. And I went to my good buddy, Les Payne. He was a journalist there with Newsday. And I said, Les, what do you think of this work? He said, oh, don't buy that. It looks flat. It's not, please don't buy this. So I didn't buy it. Well, a couple years later, August Wilson wrote a play that was inspired by this work of art. He had never seen the original. He had seen a print of it. In fact, he never actually met Bearden. August Wilson, whom I happened to meet later, was very shy, a tremendous playwright. Wrote this, got a Pulitzer Prize for this play, and it was on Broadway, and it was, this image was plastered all over Europe, all over the US, and I'm kicking myself for not having acquired that work of art. A couple years later, Bearden died. I think Bearden died in '88. So I was in New York visiting his widow, Nanette, and I was telling her this very sad story. I said, Nanette, I was with Romy at the Cordia Ekstrom Gallery, and I passed up on the piano lesson, and she quietly got up, and my friend Les Payne was with me, by the way. She quietly went up, went to a closet, pulled out this painting. I had it packed up that same day and had it shipped to Detroit. Anyway, that's one of my stories, and I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. It's wonderful to hear your story of how your passion for art began with a date. We certainly encourage, the museums are wonderful places for people to come and enjoy with one another. So what a fantastic way to start. Our third and final featured speaker this evening is Eleanore De Sole. Eleanore and her husband, Domenico, are ardent patrons of the arts, which they enjoy living with in their fabulous Hilton Head home. Eleanore is originally from the Low Country of South Carolina, and she and her husband chose to return here in 2004 after 2 decades of living in Europe in support of her husband's career with Gucci Group. Eleanore graduated from Tulane University and worked for NASDAQ and IBM early in her career. And while overseas, she devoted her time and talent to a variety of wonderful volunteer positions, serving on boards associated with the Madeira School, the American International School of Florence in Italy, and the Benjamin West Group of the Royal Academy. After returning to the U.S., she has continued her service to the arts, serving on boards at the Savannah College of Art and Design here, as well as at the Aspen Art Museum in Colorado, which has just opened an extraordinary new building. I hope some of you have been seeing that in the news, a really wonderful, fabulous new contemporary building. Eleanore and Domenico De Sole's collection features works by modern and contemporary masters, including Cy Twombly, Bryce Marden, Ellsworth Kelly, as well as modern Italian artists such as Giorgio Morandi, Piero Manzoni, and Lucio Fontana. As a prominent auctioneer friend once said, their collection is a reflection of their personalities, refined, restrained, and elegant. We are so delighted to have with us this evening Eleanore De Sole.
It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. Like Walter, art was not a part of what I grew up with. Domenico and I have been married 40 years, and we started out in an apartment. And like so many other young couples, we put posters on our walls because they were colorful, they were inexpensive, and they were easy to frame yourself. So the price points were really good, and then we were blessed by being able to have a house, and we kind of looked around and thought, okay, what do we do now? So we did the next most logical thing. We went to his parents and stole 2 of their works and put them in the living room because we thought that was sort of the position where most people would enjoy it and see it. So we really did not collect. And at times I really have a hard time sort of dealing with that term collector. It turns into a passion. It's just not an activity. It becomes a passion. Now, when Domenico and I got married, our passion at the time, and still is actually, sailing, which is one reason we're probably over on Hilton Head. It's an island and you can sail. But one time we were walking in Southport, Connecticut, in front of the Questar Art Gallery, and their niche was maritime marine art. And in the window, Domenico saw this picture of a ship. It was a steamer, I believe. I think that was the first one. It was a steamer, and he said, let's go in and look around. So we go in, and we talk to the gallery owner, and Domenico's thinking, can we afford it? Can we afford it? And he decided we were going to bite the bullet, and we were going to buy this Antonio Jacobson. Now, fast forward a little bit, we decided that was the way we were going to go because it would look beautiful in the house, and it was a passion that we had. Well, the good news is Antonio Jacobson was not exactly one of a kind. He did 6,000 works in his lifetime. He painted every single ship, every single steamer, every single sailboat, so that owners would have a history of what they had. So over the years, we were able to acquire these at lower price points than that. So anyway, it brought us incredible pleasure, and we would look at them every single day, and I will tell you, we are still looking at them every single day, because we still have them. We moved overseas, as Lisa referred to, which gave us a whole new opportunity to explore art galleries, similar to Walter, and to just open our eyes to what the cultural world was overseas. Now, we once again, we were in Italy, and I think we were in Milan, and Domenico and I walked in front of another, it was not an art gallery, it was an auction house. That's when I learned the word asta. That was the word for auction, asti. And so there was this really sizable, large painting in the window. And Domenico, you know, one of those, come on, let's go in. And we go in because it's an antique military scene, and his father was a general in the Italian army, and Domenico adores military history. So he thought, okay, this is a good extension. Let's go in and see what the possibilities are. So he was desperate to get his hands on it. But there was one caveat, and he said, look, to the owner, I need assurances that if I bid on this and I get this work of art, I can take it back to the United States, because that's where I'm headed. And the answer was no. We cannot give you, we cannot give you those assurances, because it was over 100 years old, and Italy doesn't part with anything of a certain age. So he was a little down and out, and in his capacity running this luxury goods company, on his board he had a gentleman by the name of Simone Dupree, who later on went on to run an auction house, Dupree. And Simone and Domenico were having a casual conversation over some board meeting at some point, I'm sure. And Domenico was telling him the story about this antique art. And he said, you know, I really want something meaningful about Italy, so when I go back to the United States, I can kind of remember it, look at it on the wall, and think this is really great. And Simone says, well, there's this great artist. He's really undervalued, and, you know, he's not on the radar screen. His name's Lucio Fontana. So we said, okay, you know, that's great. We'll go start looking at him. Well, the good news is he was under the radar screen, and we were able to acquire 3 works of Fontana. And then he started to get a little bit more known, and we thought, well, you know what, we're not going to keep buying just one artist like we did the Jacobsons, because we had the Jacobsons and now we had the Fontanas, and we said, okay, so let's branch out, but let's have the Italian theme. So then from there, we went to auction and art fairs. More than some galleries, but that's where we tended to expand our knowledge of Italian art. And we went to a Sotheby's auction, I remember, and Domenico and I always had a rule: you put in place a limit as to what you're going to spend it for. And I'll let you do the next photo here so you have an idea. This is by Giorgio Morandi. And Morandi is well known for painting bottles. Now, it's not everybody's taste, but for me, this is a jewel, it's a gem. And this man lived in his house, and all he painted were bottles, flowers in bottles, and outside the window of his home. And he's still under the radar screen, in my opinion, for Italian art, because some of them are going through the roof, Fontana included. But this was the next one that we bought, and it's in our living room here in Hilton Head. And from there, we just kind of continued to branch out what we could afford and what we were interested in. It includes Manzoni, and a little story on Manzoni is we have a little piece that's about that big. Again, you know, you can't buy that because it's a little bit more expensive than that. So we start out with this little one, and then we decide we want to get a little bigger one. And I was in a airport, and I was given the duty of doing the bidding over the telephone at auction on a much larger one. And as with this, we set a limit. And the problem with auction houses is you just want it so badly, and you're not thinking about the commission that you got to pay on top of it, because they never put that price out there for you, and you just want to inch up a little bit more. Well, the bottom line on the big Manzoni is we lost it to the next person who bid, and to this day, my husband is blaming me for that particular loss. But we moved on, and then we got Boet Moretti, who's part of the Arte Povera series, Castellani, who, interestingly enough, is still living well into his 90s. We like older artists. Malotti, he does small sculptures. We have Buri. We have a good selection of Italian artists. But then we were moving back to the US, and it was kind of, okay, now we've fulfilled our Italian dream. Where do we go to next? Because by that point, the Italian artists had taken off. You were never going to get another deal anywhere. And we started going to art fairs again. And it kind of opened up our eyes to a much larger work of abstract expressionist and contemporary. And our children were gone. They'd finished college and graduate school. We had a little bit more disposable money. And we would go down to the art fairs in Miami and also to Switzerland. And if you go back to this one, what we would try to do is justify acquisitions with some sort of theme. So this, from 2009, was at Art Basel, Miami, and it had been on display in 2009 at a show in Rome. So I said, ooh, this is good. We've got the Italian, we've got the contemporary, it kind of goes. I justified it. About 7 or 8 years ago, there was a Cy Twombly that I said to Domenico, we have to have it. He said, no, we don't have to have it. I said, yes, we do. It's from his Roma series. So we, in fact, acquired that. So we are all over the board. But there is one common thread amongst all of it. From the 2 pieces we stole from his parents, which we still have on the walls, to the Jacobsons, to the Italian masters, to these, is that we both have to love it, and I mean love it. Not like it, not buy it because you think you're going to make more money on it by flipping it, and they're all on the wall. So, excuse me, so in the end, am I a collector? I guess you would say I'm a collector, but it's a passion, and you know, it's just kind of transitioned. And there's one more picture after this, which is just another example of some of the Italian art. This is by an artist by the name of Marino Marini, and he's most famously known for fabulous sculptures. He has a huge one in front of the Peggy Guggenheim in Venice. We couldn't go down that alley, so you go for the next best. You go for a work on canvas. So that kind of concludes my remarks, and we all look forward to questions.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tanya Salmons. I'm Senior Curator of Decorative Arts and Historic Sites at Telfair Museums, and I was one of the curators who worked on this exhibition along with Lisa, Harry, and Courtney, who are here in the front row. We had a lot of fun doing this exhibition, but it's my responsibility tonight to field questions from the audience. So we have, I think, about 10 minutes to take some questions. So any questions out there? Nobody?
You're shy.
Actually, I've got a question.
Okay.
One of the panelists, Dr. Duncan, Dr. Evans, and Ms. De Sole, and that is, what is their absolute favorite piece in their collection that they possess now or have ever possessed, and why?
Do you all hear that? Okay. John, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess mine would be the Peter Gordon, some call it Noble Jones, engraving of Savannah as it stood in 1734. I came by it wonderfully, I think. We had gone to Europe. Well, first off, Ginger was sitting shop. A lady came in and said, you know, I have an old picture of Savannah, and I want to sell it. And Ginger said, well, we need to see it first because we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
She sent it to us. We were in Europe for 2 or 3 months. It got delivered next door, which was a SCAD dormitory, basically. It stayed in their hallway for 2 or 3 months. And then when we got back from Europe, the SCAD student brought it over and said, "This has been waiting for you." Well, it was real, and I called her up and apologized, and we made a quick deal, and I love it.
Thank you. Walter.
Well, I can't answer that question. As Eleanor has stated, I have to love the work that I buy. And if you buy as much work as I do, you're going to come across a few mistakes. But even so, when I get works like that, you know, are not as they appear to be, and I always go to major galleries or auction houses, Sotheby's, Christie's, what have you, they'll take it back. So I don't sell works, so they're all my children, and I don't have a favorite child.
And I'm afraid I have to share that. It's very difficult. You know, you're passionate about it. You love each and every one of them. Yes, we made a couple of mistakes, excuse me, but we still have those mistakes.
Other questions? Yes.
So one of the side diseases of being a collector is running out of wall space. What do you do then?
It has never been a problem for me. Under my bed, there are 59 Ann Taylor Nash paintings. We've got a top floor that Ginger calls the explosion room, and it is packed with stuff.
Under my bed, in the closets. I also collect books, manuscripts, documents. I have over 100,000 books in my house. And I don't loan those out too often, but occasionally do. With the artwork, we always have at least a couple hundred works on loan throughout the country and in Europe, so that helps to take up the space. And we donated quite a number of works to a number of museums. But we also have about 4 or 5 storage areas, in addition to the closets, the bed, under the beds, and everywhere else. And I'm trying to, my good buddy over here says that he never wants to be cured. I actually would like to be cured.
Well, we are dealing with dozens. We are not dealing with hundreds. And what you do is you just move it around. You know, instead of 1 on a wall, you may have a couple on the wall or 8 on the wall if their work's on paper or something like that. I'd like to have hundreds, but...
Other questions?
I have a question. Dr. Evans, it seems as you have accumulated a lot of knowledge over these years and a big collection. Do you ever call in or have a curator help you make these choices? Or are they all internal?
You mean in terms of purchasing?
Yes.
Well, let me tell you this. When I started collecting, in Detroit,
Yeah.
The museum really wasn't that interested in what I was doing. They had a significant amount of African American art, but they never showed it. But as time went on, and the interest, and I mentioned this fellow's name, Dick Manoogian in Detroit. He had a lot to do with this because one day he called me and he said, "I want to set up, I want to meet you." He did this through his foundation director. And I said, "Richard Manoogian wants to meet me?" I mean, that's like having, Henry Ford, coming to your house. He said, "Yeah, I want to." So Linda cooked a nice dinner, and we served some decent wine and everything. And he came right out. He said, Richard Manoogian has the largest collection of American art, period. period, on the planet. And he lives in and around Detroit, several homes there. But anyway, he said, I want you to help me collect African American art. I want to add it to my American work, which it should have been. So I took off from my work as a surgeon, and we went around the country, mostly New York, and I helped him. And he
helped him. He didn't help you.
Well, he's an authority now. He sent his curator with us, John Bose. We went, and John Bose is an authority on African American art now. But what happened is we would go to auctions or go to galleries, and right away they recognized him. He had 2 galleries in New York and 1 in Santa Fe. So everybody knew him. They knew, but he couldn't hide it. The museum suddenly got interested. I'm not saying that's the only reason. But so then Detroit Institute of Art, they invited me to be on their board. I'm still on their board. I'm on their board to this day. I was on the executive committee and everything else. But they got real interested at that point. But I was getting ready to leave to come to Savannah. This is my last few days. But they offered their curatorial services and everything else at that point. It was a little too late.
Okay, I think, yes, a question up here.
Dr. Evans, I wonder if you could tell us anything from your insider knowledge about the recent turmoil with the bankruptcy in Detroit and all the talk about how we're just going to sell all the artwork. And then one day I turn on the PR and they say, oh, the artwork's all safe, don't worry about it.
Well, there was some worry at the point. I mean, if you have a few hours, I can go into that because I know a lot of these players there in Detroit and what's happening there. I never felt that artwork, I mean, the Detroit Institute of Art is one of the largest and most prestigious art museums in this country, and I knew that collection was not going anywhere. But basically what happened, I'm sure you know a lot of this, is that many of the foundations got together, the Ford Foundation, the Kresge, and a few of these other foundations that had an interest in Detroit, and a few that did not, that weren't from there. And they put up the money that was required by the bankruptcy attorneys. So the collections are safe. Hopefully it'll never be owned by the city again. I'm hoping, and that people won't be afraid to, let's say, donate their artwork to the city, because that's where most of the collection has come from. But I can talk to you afterwards, but I hope you have a lot of time.